we we are going to start right away, and I would like to introduce Peter with a little bit of a bio here. For the first time, its 90-year history, the Shellbacks will be presented with a book club format. The book we'll be looking at is out there. The Batshit Antics of the World's Great Explorers. The author, Peter Rowe, has presented 4 times before at the Shellback Club. He's a prolific producer of marine-themed films. His feature films on the water include Treasure Island with Jack Palance, Lost, and Horse Latitudes, the story of the round-the-world sailor Donald Crowhurst, starring Gordon Pinsent. Peter's other films and series include Exploring Under Sail, Angry Planet, and Shipwreck on a Great Lake. Since losing his voice in a filming accident in 2015, Peter has moved from TV to books. He has written and published 4 books, including Adventures in Filmmaking, Music versus the Man, and Ablaze, 10 Years That Shook the World, and is now writing a new one. Peter is also a longtime sailor. He worked in the 80s as skipper of a Bahamas charter boat and sailed a Mirage 35 Blade Runner for many years in California, Mexico, up the US East Coast, and here on Lake Ontario. He now races a 1988 CNC 35 Mark III called Restless out of Mimico Cruising Club, and is also a volunteer skipper on the classic yawl Jalassi for the Broadreach Foundation. Let's please give Peter a nice warm Shellbacks welcome. Good to have you here, Peter. And so what we're going to look at now is a bit of a PowerPoint that I put together. And I put it together because the book is really complex. Lots of things to remember. And so what I want you to do as we go through this, even if you have read the book, is think about the explorer you most admire and why, and also think about the attitudes towards the indigenous population and women. So if we can go to the next slide. And I can't control this here myself. Can we make this bigger?
That depends on your screen. It's each person can control it.
So how do I do that? Oh, here we are. Just a minute. Plus, plus, plus. And now I'm losing some of it. It's at the top of this. Oh, good, good, good. We're getting this better. Now, are you seeing, is everybody seeing this?
Yes.
Okay, let's go even higher. Okay, so we have in the book 4 eras of exploration: the ancient era, and that's Marco Polo, Leif Erikson, etc. And then the Great Age of Discovery from 1400 to 1800, and we'll take a tiny look at that in a minute. And then the book focuses mainly on the wacky third period from 1800 to 1940. And I loved your expression here, Peter, the heroic era, fucking maniacal. Independent exploration peaked, and the madcap adventurers charged off to unknown parts, hell-bent on testing themselves against the worst that nature could answer. Jim, you've got your hand raised. Did you have a comment there?
Yes, I am honored to know Peter Rowe and Jacques Cousteau, and I would like to mirror the book where Peter ends his book by comments about Jacques Cousteau. And having met Jacques Cousteau and shaking their hands with this hand, I feel honored to know the 2 of them. And thank you very much for writing this book, Peter. And it's a marvelous book. And I think you had I liked your language or your lack of inhibition in the language. It was fun to read. And I
Thank you.
learned a few juicy sayings in the book. Great book, Peter. Thank you very much. And I knew Merica Weiler, one of your assistants, in one of your movie making experiences. So, and I'm glad you're here and with us. Carry on.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay,
Thank you.
no, we've got this way too big. Peter, did you want to respond to that?
Well, just to say thank you, Jim. That was very, very nice of you to say that. Thanks a lot.
Okay, next slide, please. So our great age of discovery included Columbus, Magellan, Drake, Cartier, Cook, Vancouver, and Cabot. Next slide. And I'm only taking a look at one person here, and that's Columbus. He was much lauded, but as Peter so aptly noted, the Americas were explored and lived in by indigenous folks for over 10,000 years. Europeans from Scandinavia and perhaps Ireland had it to North America before Columbus set sail, and Columbus explored the Caribbean and Central America, but never set foot anywhere in North America. Next slide, please.
Just a second.
Okay. By the way, if you have any comments as we go through this, please don't hesitate to jump in. I may have way more information here than you need. Oh, I'm wondering if I can do this myself here. No. How are we doing, Graham?
You got the next slide.
No, I haven't.
Yes.
There we are.
That,
And this one is, okay, you went back. This one is Pope Nicholas V and his doctrine of discovery, Dum Diversus. And actually that's probably a pretty good name for it, dumb. That's Latin. It was a guide for explorers. And it basically said, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all pagans, reduce their person to perpetual slavery, convert them to Christianity, and all inhabitants, dominions, possessions, and goods were to be claimed for his use and profit. And the Vatican on Thursday, and that was in March of 2023, repudiated the doctrine of discovery. It took that many years. The theory is backed by 15th century papal decrees that legitimized colonial era seizure of native lands and form the basis of some property laws today. And so, pardon? That I thought was a really important point because that explains a lot of what the explorers did. Okay, next slide, please. So the wacky third period, madcap adventurers charged off. And here are some examples of what they did. Alexander von Humboldt, a geologist and geographer of South America. He did scientific writing, but he purposely shocked himself with an eel to see what it would feel like. James Holman, who was totally blind, traveled around the world and wrote several books, and he explored Brazil on horseback. And Fitzwilliam Owen was authorized for the mapping of expeditions worldwide. Next slide, please. And so we start with the first great adventure to find Timbuktu. It was called the Cité Mystérieuse. And there's a map of where it is. That was my curiosity right away. So it's in Mali. and sort of on the west of central west of Africa. Next slide, please. And the first person who found the Niger was a Scottish doctor of 24. I was always astounded by the young age of some of these people. His travels were disastrous, but the public response was exuberant, and he had a best-selling book. And this kind of thing repeats itself as we go through. And on his second trip, they were dressed in military attire, attacked by bees, lions, wild duck, crocodiles. Next slide, please. And then there was Hugh Clapperton, who was led by Walter Oudney, who was self-effacing. Clapperton, however, was vulgar, conceited, and quarrelsome. Lieutenant Dexon Denham was also with him, and he was a prig, a snob, a martinet. So a totally mismatched team across the Sahara. And I have little asterisks throughout this, and these are places where Peter has also done some traveling, exploration. And we may ask him about some of those things afterwards. Next slide. Part of the problem with doing exploration in the southern hemisphere is the map, and the map notoriously inflated the size of Europe and distorted the southern continents, making them smaller. So it wasn't surprising that there was some confusion in traveling across. Next slide, please. Lang actually did reach Timbuktu in 1826 after a year of hardship, heat, illness, and bloodshed. The city, as he found it, was in fatal decline, and he was murdered by a sheikh there, and that sheikh also burned all of his papers, so we don't have accurate information about what he did. Next slide, please. And then René Caillé, inspired by the life and adventures of Robinson Crusoe, as were many people. He applied for a 10,000 franc prize offered by the Geographic Society. He chose to dress as a Muslim. He learned Arabic and studied the Quran, and he reached the Niger and Timbuktu in 1828, and as a result received the award and a pension of 3,000 francs a year. Next slide. So the issues for this group of people was their unrealistic needs of such exploration, the maps, the various hazards. The native, mostly Muslim population often had a low regard for British explorers, and as the British explorers had a low regard for them, so ended up with desert marauders, lots of relationships with native women, the heat, the loss of animals, disease also affected them. So the next slide. The Northwest Passage, the biggest, not the biggest, but another adventure that was taken up by many people. And so here we have a map of the Northwest Passage. And if you look at these routes, the white one was Amundsen, and he was the first to navigate the Northwest Passage. And then way back in 1940, 42, 44, we've got the RCMP, Saint Roch. The rest was Franklin's attempt. The pink was Perry's attempt. And Robert McClure proved that the route existed over ice and water. So his is orange. Next slide, please. And of course, we have Franklin. 1845, he went off with the Airbus and Terror. He had 20 horsepower steam engines versus 40,000 horsepower diesel engines today. Franklin was 59 years old when he started. He was a weak leader, wildly unrealistic goals, and many could see the recklessness of the Franklin crew. Chief Akaicho was a leader of the native guides, and then his wife was his greatest ally and an explorer in her own right. The next slide, please. John Ray, and this is one that Peter sees as one of the most skilled explorers ever to travel the Arctic, but the most maligned and controversial. He worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. He did 3 trips north, mapped the coastline of the Northwest Passage while looking for Franklin ships. And he never found them, but the Inuit told him of skeletons of 34 white men and showed him many artifacts, including a small silver plate engraved Sir John Franklin, KCH. And he also learned of the cannibalism that happened. Next slide, please. Charles Francis Hall was an unlikely explorer. He high school dropout, no marine or wilderness or navigation training, but he searched for Franklin. And he was the first to identify with the natives and to refer to what they called themselves, the Inuit. He did find remains of the 16th century Martin Frobisher expeditions, and he was supported by Lady Franklin. Next slide, please. These two were constant companions of Hall till the day of his violent death, and I don't remember who killed him, but and I don't know how to pronounce their names, but I'll try it. Taklituk taught Hall to speak Inuktitut, and Hall taught her to speak in English. And Hall recognized her as one tough woman who had a degree of calm and intellectual power about her. And she was supported by her husband, Ipirvik. Next slide, please. And then we have Roald Amundsen, and he was arguably the most accomplished polar explorer of all time. He was the first to cross the Northwest Passage by ship in mid-August of 1905. And on August 26th, they encountered a ship bearing down on them from the west. And that was from his own diary. He said, a strange feeling welled up in my throat. I was somewhat overstrained and wore. It was a weakness in me, but I felt tears in my eyes. Vessel in sight, vessel in sight. And the next crossing of the Northwest Passage done by the RCMP in 1940 used Ray's routes as others that followed. Next slide. Vilhjalmur Stephenson. Ada Blackjack was the only survivor of an attempt by him, and he was born in Manitoba, Tim Stevenson. His attempt was to occupy and claim for Canada a Russian island called Wrangel Island. The Russians laughed. Ada later acclaimed as the first Eskimo heroine by the Toronto Mail and Empire. Stephenson adopted the customs of the Inuit. Alan Crawford, there's an Alan Crawford Prize in Chemistry and Physics that's still awarded today, and there was some sort of a romantic relationship between Ada and him. And the 1913-16 expedition that queered Stephenson's reputation as he abandoned his icebound ship, Karluk. Next slide, please. So the issues here for this group were the arrogance of the explorers towards the indigenous population, the propaganda against Ray. There was much dissing of one explorer versus another. For self-aggrandizement, there were massive egos. There was fighting for funding, and there was also less than adequate clothing. Next slide. So this takes us to the search for the source of the Nile. And Ptolemy, 2,000 years prior, postulated correctly that it was the Lake Victoria, which is right down here. This map says it was Kigali, and there is indeed a river that goes into Lake Victoria. And the falls are at the north end of the lake, and then it goes up to Khartoum, up the White Nile, and there's the Blue Nile over here as well. So, and it seems to start in Lake Tana. And then, of course, it goes up to the Mediterranean Sea. So the two rivers meet in the Sudanese capital of Khartoum. So which Nile is the source of the Nile? Is it the White Nile or the Blue Nile? So again, another discussion point. Next slide, please. So we have Sir Richard Francis Burton, who was nicknamed Ruffian Dick because one, he had a wild, rambunctious childhood. He had an inability to buckle under authority, but he was brilliant, fluent in 29 languages and apparently innumerable sexual positions. He studied Sikhism, Islam, received a Muslim circumcision, studied the Quran, and was able to be called a Hafiz, which means that he could quote it, he memorized it. And under cover, he went to a Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca and risked the penalty of death, but he never got over losing the race to the source of the Nile, to his puritanical partner, John Speke, on the next slide. And John Speke was handsome, a repressed homosexual, perhaps, had an unhealthy relationship with his mother. He was a notorious killer of African animals. He was also a political and social reactionary along with Richard Burton. He was unimaginative, unintellectual. He traveled with these three folks and found the mouth of the Nile, Nyanza, in 1862. And by the way, there is a possibility that the Lake Victoria will be renamed Nyanza. Nyanza is, I forget what language, but it means lake. But that's how it was referred to before it was renamed Lake Victoria. And Speke either committed suicide or had an accidental death before the debate as to who discovered the source. And the debate was to have been in front of Livingston. Next slide, please. There was another pair of people who searched for Lake Albert. They were the first vanilla-hued, that is Peter's term, crowd to see the waterfall in the river flowing from the north of Lake Victoria. And he became known as Baker of the Nile as a result of that. But she was wealthy, sponsored everything, and he was, among many of explorers of the day, a racist. And next slide, please. David Livingstone, fierce will to succeed, poverty-stricken childhood, 7 kids. He was a manic depressive. A missionary explorer was seen as careless and sloppy. Flogged, disobedient, and insolent porters, probably. So this is interesting because he flogged them, and yet he probably did more than any other explorer to end the slave trade. He was not heard from for a long period, and he died in 1873, received more acclaim perhaps than he deserved. And of course, who was sent to find him? But next slide. Henry Morton Stanley. And he was a Welsh bastard. And I put that in quotes because that was put on his birth certificate because he was born out of wedlock. Interestingly, Charles used to say that he wasn't a bastard because of that exactly, and that he was baptized by the maid in the bath. Stanley escaped the workhouse and at an early age and emigrated to the U.S. He was a skilled. He sent his paper sent him to find Livingston. And of course, this is the famous quote, Dr. Livingston, I presume, who was found in the village of Ujiji on Lake Tanganyika in present-day Tanzania. And he wrote a bestseller, How I Found Livingston. Next slide. And here we have one woman who did some exploration. She was born into wealth. She was Dutch. She did much exploration research from the age of 16. She ignored naysayers. She searched the Nile and Timbuktu. She bought slaves to free them. She had a cache of photographs. She was a self-taught photographer. But in spite of all of this, she received few honors, and she was violently murdered in the end. Next slide, please. And the issues here were dying porters and dying pack animals, illness, marsh fever, malaria, the weather, miasmatic putredities. How do you say that, Peter? God-forsaken shits. Can you say that? Can you say miasmatic putridities?
Yes, I think so.
And red ants and difficulty taking joint responsibility for success. And they ostracized women. Next slide, please. And here we have the race for the poles. Next slide, please. The first undisputed expedition to reach the North Pole was that of the airship Norge, which overflew the area in 1926 with 16 men on board, including the expedition leader, Roald Amundsen. And so prior expeditions were Perry, Hall, Nansen, Cook, and Robert Peary. So many people attempted the North Pole. Next slide, please. Charles Hall, he attempted to find Franklin and he set sail on the Polaris, but there was no leadership. He was apparently poisoned by arsenic. His ship got stranded, 2 captains aboard, and he abandoned a party of 20. We have Takulichuk and Epirvik were also there, and they were eventually rescued by a sealer who took them to Newfoundland. They did a lot of trekking across the ice before they were finally found. Next slide, please. Nansen in 1893, mentee was Roald Amundsen, and he sailed the Fram and used sledges with a handpicked team of 13, and there was no hierarchy. They were all Norwegian, but they did not reach the goal. This man, however, had a lot of integrity. He became a diplomat for Norway and worked towards having it become a distinct country. He joined the League of Nations, later the UN, worked on behalf of displaced persons and refugees from World War I, which resulted in his getting a Nobel Peace Prize in 1922. Next slide, please. Frederick Cook in 1908 was an American explorer, physician, and ethnographer, most known for allegedly being the first to reach the pole. And I noticed that word allegedly on April 21st, 1908. And he also tried for the Antarctic with Amundsen. Next slide, please. Robert Peary, in 1909, he made 4 attempts and did it for the love of country. Was completely dependent on Matthew Henson, who spoke Inuk and could drive dog sleds. Henson was black. Peary was a racist. He paid him half of the other members of the team, and he insisted that Henson call him sir. He had a disregard for things held sacred by the Inuit. He stole them for the Museum of Natural History in New York, dug up graves for bones. Not untypical of many British. Okay, next slide. Attempts for the South Pole were Ernest Shackleton, Roald Amundsen, and Robert Falcon Scott. Amundsen reached the pole in 1911. Next slide, please. Ernest Shackleton crossed the Drake Passage, purchased the Nimrod for his first attempt, was seen as an old woman, almost always panicking, was a consummate liar and practiced hypocrite. In June 1910, made a second attempt. 1914, sailed on the Endurance, and the ship was crushed in the ice and sank. Could be egalitarian and inspiring leader or authoritarian. And in the end, we know he had a heroic rescue of his men. So although he didn't reach the pole, he ensured that his men survived. Next slide, please. Roald Amundsen, arguably the most accomplished polar explorer of all time, first to cross the Northwest Passage by ship in 1905, next spun by the RCMP using Ray's route, as did others, and then reached the South Pole in December of 1911, and his whole crew was healthy, scurvy-free, well rested, and they wore Arctic furs. Next slide, please. Scott only reached 82 degrees. He was with the British Royal Navy. He was moody, of esteem, with Edward Wilson and Shackleton at one point. They wore canvas jackets. They found Amundsen's tents and were beaten by 34 days. And then they were caught in a severe storm and their bodies were found frozen 9 months later. Next slide, please. The issues here were the Arctic winter. 751 people died trying to get there. They had canned food, but no can opener. Records were faked, racism, canvas jackets for the British, and an interesting phenomenon, the guardian angel phenomenon, which apparently happened to many folks trying these journeys. Next slide, please. And our last area of search were the lost cities of Latin America. John Lloyd Steeves in 1840-41 found Copan, a Mayan city. Hiram Bingham III, model for Indiana Jones, and Alexander Hamilton Rice made it to Cusco, Choqquequirao, the cradle of gold, and Machu Picchu, Kofopuna, Tupac Amura, and Rice became the director of the Harvard Institute for Geographical Exploration. And then the Ciudad Blanca, the lost city found by an archaeological team using LIDAR. And I think that might be the city of Zed. LIDAR, light detection and ranging technology. I think that's still used today, and maybe Peter can answer that question for other trips, other explorations. I had not been familiar with LIDAR prior to this. Peter, do you have any comment about that, the use of LIDAR in exploration?
It's very new. It's only less than 10 years old. So absolutely, it's very important way to try and find things
Excellent.
underneath the jungle.
Excellent. Okay, next slide, please. So our explorers were Percy Fawcett, lost with his son Jack during an expedition to find the ancient lost city of Zed in the Amazon. Theodore Mord was an adventurer, explorer, diplomat, spy, journalist, and television news producer, best known for his unverified claim of discovering the lost city of Monkey God. Next slide. And here we have, I think we've missed one slide there.
No.
No, okay. Here we have Bingham III, Theodore Mord, Alexander Hamilton Rice, and Percy Fawcett. Next slide, please. And the issues in searching here were disease, which resulted in a massive reduction of populations, the theft of antiquities, the theft of food within groups who were exploring, murder, unfriendly Indians, and again, squabbles over who had publication rights. Next slide, please. And so Jacques Cousteau was a modern, is he still alive? I'm not sure. No. He was an environmental activist, filmmaker, visionary, fighter for the French resistance, officer in the French Navy, 50-year of exploration of undersea world on 2 ships, both named Calypso, recipient of many awards, a role model and influencer of future generations. And a quote here from him: suppress fear, risk itself is only a threat, fear is an enemy. In the face of a danger, one requires clear-witted reaction. Fear clouds judgment. And I would add that if you want to consider greatest explorers, you could look at Jane Goodall and David Attenborough. And next slide. And here we have our author. And Peter had many adventures of his own, swimming with piranhas, overland to Timbuktu, a trip to the Arctic on skis, a movie, and Don Starkle's trip from Winnipeg to the mouth of the Amazon, filming a Hamilton and Scourge, ballooning for Turkey and Egypt, Elephant Island exploration, Cano Crystals, a rainbow-hued river in South America, Amazonia and wild animals and cave diving. I may have left a few out there, but Peter, afterwards, if you wanted to talk about any one of those, that would be good. So that's the end of the little PowerPoint, and perhaps too much. So let's take a look now at some possible discussion questions. For 150 years, explorers like Franklin, Scott, Shackleton have been lionized by the press and the public. This book describes explorers in a warts and all manner. Do you feel it is a fair representation of these explorers? Any comments or questions here?
Yeah, it's Phil McNaughton. I'll start by saying yes, mainly because we all know that there are two sides to all of us. There's the side that we present to a lot of people, and also the side that definitely is batshit when we're dealing with some others and when we're on our own. I enjoyed it particularly for the parts about Bingham, because I was at Machu Picchu when I was still in school, and it was quite fascinating because that was 1969, and we still at that point did not know much about what Machu Picchu was really about, and where it stood in relation to everything else, because it wasn't until they were looking for oil that they found there isn't just Machu Picchu. There's 6 or 7 others that are the same and roughly located in the same sort of general area. And they formed sort of a line, which it turns out aligns with the marking on a stone in Machu Picchu itself. But I was quite fascinated by your descriptions of Bingham, because I'd never heard of the story of him erasing the graffiti that was there so that nobody else could think somebody else found it first, sending stuff back as J.P. Simmons, and the fact that he had the amount of looting, it's the only way to call it, that they did when the Peruvians thought that the Yale University had 5,600 items and discovered they had over 46,000, because he'd sent a lot of stuff back to a J.P. Simmons, knowing that anything with his name on it would probably get opened. So I enjoyed that part of the book very, very much. Thank you, Peter. It's been very, very good to read.
Thank you.
Jim, you've got your hand up.
Jacques Cousteau died in 1987, 97. At the age of 87, he had a heart attack.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody else have to respond to, do you feel it's a fair representation of these explorers? Elsa. Jim, we'll come back to you.
Oh,
Elspeth, unmute yourself.
Yeah, as I say, I didn't read the book. My apologies, Peter. However, I did read a book about John Ray when he worked for the Hudson Bay thing, and what he did is absolutely amazing. There's one trip it took him nearly 400 days to get somewhere. And when he did return to Scotland, got no recognition for the work he did. And I can't remember who wrote the book, but I was given it by my cousin. But it was a fascinating book, and he was a fascinating man. Hi, Colin.
Thank you, Elspeth. Laurel?
Yeah, I don't know any different, so I'm assuming it's a fair representation. I was curious, Peter, how did you acquire all the information about their personalities, if they were arrogant or conceited or megalomaniacal? How did all that come up? I'm not sure that would be just public reading.
Well, as you can imagine, this is not the first book about explorers. In fact, for instance, David Livingstone, there are 185 biographies written about David Livingstone. Someone with nothing better to do counted them all up. So it's just a case of digging through the information that's out there. Obviously, they're all dead now, and the people who wrote about them are dead. But the words continue, and so I read a lot of material and boiled down books that are 300 pages down to half a page. And so that's how I did it.
That had to have been a huge challenge.
Yeah,
and
that's what I thought. I thought, having to do all that reading, and there's a ton of research that comes out in this book. That's a gargantuan task.
Gargantuan task. And I really appreciated seeing them as people as opposed to dates and places, but to see them and to understand how teams could get together and they could have such angst amongst them. That happens today in anything we do. We just received an email this morning from Mimico Cruising Club saying that the chair of the garden committee has resigned because there was some question about who should be setting up an agenda. So I have to say that didn't happen just once. It had to have been more than once. But in any event, that's a small example of what happens today. Michael, can you show us yourself? You have to unmute yourself, but we don't have you visually either. Michael Kane, are you hearing me? Okay, Michael, we'll come back to you. Now, the next question, what do you think of the author's opinion of Jacques Cousteau as what he called the world's greatest explorer? I'd like to respond to that. I certainly think that with what he did it in an environmentally sound way. He created movies and programs that were educational for young people, an amazing role model for young people moving forward. And I think that if you are going to be a great explorer, that those aspects of exploration have to be part of it. Other folks that might be considered there, I've just got a book here called The Code Breaker, and this is all about Jennifer Doudna on gene editing. And so she's exploring in the scientific world, perhaps one of the most important understandings that we might have about the human body. Jim, your comments.
Oh, I think the appeal of Cousteau is that he had a good sense of ethics and wanting to do things for the world and the rest of humanity, which is outstanding. One of my curiosities in evolution is, will humanity ever outgrow wars? And
good question.
And I also have a final question to Peter. I love what should I say, the unreserved language with which you wrote the book. Did you have a good beer in hand or tequila or something as a helper?
the answer to that, I'm afraid, is no, because not only can I not speak very well, but I also cannot drink anything, not even water, let alone tequila. However, I do have some big news, at least big news for me, which is I had an art show at our yacht club, and a woman came up to me, told me about the fact that she had a father, I think it was, that had a similar voice to mine, and it had been repaired by a doctor with a new technique. So I found out about this, and I went to see this doctor. She's at St. Michael's Hospital, and the big news for me is she believes she can do surgery on me, and it's on May the 9th, and it will get me back
Fantastic.
my voice.
Fantastic news.
Yeah, it is for me. So, Jim, regarding your earlier question or comment about Jacques Cousteau, when I was shooting my film Treasure Island in the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea, Jacques Cousteau died 1997, and the funeral was in France, in Paris, and I was such a fan that I really wanted to zip across the jet to the funeral, which was in the Notre Dame Cathedral, and on a Sunday. But the flights were too complicated, and I had to be shooting on Monday morning, so I didn't risk it. But I am a fan, of course. So are lots of other people. He was, and really, it was nothing more than the fact that he literally, by means of one, his invention of the aqualung, the respirator, that he was able to turn millions of people onto this new world of the ocean. And those that didn't get it that way got it through his many films.
That's awesome. Awesome. I can understand where you're coming from. Thank you, Jim, for your comments. Bill McNaughton, you're next.
I would just like to second the comments about Jacques Cousteau, because being of a certain age, I grew up glued to the television watching his first films that were being shown. And it was certainly a big influence on the idea of what's out there and what people can do to find things. He was really, it was quite fascinating, and he was an incredible communicator.
Definitely, definitely. Elizabeth, unmute yourself.
Few points. I certainly agree with our claim for Jacques Cousteau. And when you mention the aqualung, Peter, do you mean the scuba gear?
Yes. Jacques Cousteau.
And I think we all know what scuba stands for.
Self-contained underwater breathing
apparatus. Yeah, I thought that was brilliant. Yes, I think you're right. But I think his ethic to share what he loved to do and what he found out, that was the whole ethos of that man, was to teach, to share the information, and not get acclaim just for oneself. As we've learned, a lot of the explorers that we've written about have been that selfish.
Yeah, that's enough about good ones. Let's get back to the crazy ones.
Yeah.
Before we do that,
I'd like to comment on Franklin, because there was Diane, if you remember me bringing Doreen Green
Mhm.
She came from my marina. She was a single sailor. And she had an ancestor, a young man who was in fact a young officer on Franklin's ship. And
No
of
kidding.
course perished. And she was able to go to a museum in London and find his cutlery or his cup with his initials on.
Wow, that's amazing.
And I can remember the young fellow, the oceanographer, the film. They had been searching for the Erebus and the Terror. It hadn't been found yet, but that was an excellent presentation. And I think the thing that I sort of really recognize that humankind still does not admire or ask advice from the peoples who were here before us. It's still ongoing. There was a lot of information eventually that was given by the indigenous people in the North in the search for the passage.
I agree with you 100%
Yeah.
there. It is
Yeah.
the current discussion about the Northwest Passage and how much protection Canada should put up there. If they don't discuss with the people who live along the coast,
Mhm.
along the Northwest Passage, it's a disservice,
Yeah.
not only to them, but to us as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ron. Unmute. Thank you.
Yes, hi Peter. That was very interesting. I haven't had a look closely at your book yet, but I was wondering if you spoke at all about Mungo Park.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's the opening part of the major chapter on the search for Timbuktu. Mungo Park I didn't know anything about him except what I learned in grade 6 until researching this book. But he was a rather crazy character who ended up badly and unfortunately left a bad reputation amongst the people who lived in that area. And they suspected others who followed him to be acting in his manner. So that caused them problems. So yeah, he also had the greatest name for an explorer.
He connects actually to my family tree back in distant history. His sister married into a family line that leads down to where I am.
Oh,
Well, I hope if you have any children, you've named them Mungo.
Well, it was a debate actually for a middle name for our son. I kind of regret that I didn't insist a little more, but the name Mungo appears down the family tree every generation or two, in the Thorburn line, which is where his sister married.
isn't that interesting? Thank you, Ron. Thank you for that. Seamus, unmute yourself and you're on.
Okay, very interesting about Franklin. When I was in Tasmania many years ago, I spent about a week there. Franklin was, if my memory serves me right, he was a governor of Tasmania. Yes. And the residence in which he was a governor is still there and well looked after. But he would, while he was there, I think his wife had a problem trying to have children or something. They adopted a native child that would be Aboriginal. Yes. And actually, this was shown recently on that program called Stuff the British Stole. And on that remark, I would like to make a thing. The British weren't the only colonialists. One of the biggest contradictions about the French, and I point this out to friends with Republican leanings, that France was a colonial exploring country. So was the United States.
Italy.
So was Italy, the Netherlands. Let's not. I'm not trying to advocate anything here. Just to say that Britain wasn't the only country that followed the lessons from Rome way back. Go, my interpretation: go out and conquer and convert and so forth. Because I had relatives involved in the British Missionary Society, and they were doing the same thing as proselytizing. Let's face it, and they had all sorts of ideas that many of us today don't agree with. But getting back to Franklin, they adopted this child, and then when he was eventually transferred to some other position with his wife, they didn't take the child with them. I will assume back to England, and they literally dumped her into some sort of like home for lost children or children who were being in equivalent of residential schools in Australia, and the young thing died about 16 or 17, but she had been brought up as a child in a very unique way of life, and then to be abandoned by her parents. And the sad thing about the whole story was, which was shown in the Stuff the British showed, the child missed more than anything a little doll that she had made, I think, or somebody had made for her. And that doll was not too long ago discovered in the British Museum, but the Franklin descendants won't give permission for it to be returned to Tasmania. And it was a doll that was sort of a black doll, if I can put it that way. But when I was in Tasmania, there was a lot of interesting information about Franklin. And yes, he was a racist, but so were my ancestors racist, and I'm not responsible for what they did. And but I don't know how this reconciliation, etc. It's a huge challenge for us all, and a challenge that we've only been introduced to in recent times. Thank you for listening, and thank you for the presentation today. Forgive my memory to our guest speaker, and I admire his research. Despite losing his voice, I'm delighted that his eyes are working great to read all those books and present us with fascination. I feel ashamed that I have not your reading concentration abilities. Thank you again. Yeah, Peter Rowe, isn't that right? Isn't that who I should have mentioned?
Yes,
and by the way, I wish Peter, as we all do, every success on May the 9th, 2024. And I hope everything goes well for you.
Darn right. Darn right. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
Jim, you're next.
One of the really interesting bits was in the end about how the bones and digs from Peru were taken to the Yale Museum, and that eventually they were returned. And this was a quite additional interesting story. And thank you again, Peter, for this exploration of things that humans do.
Thank you, Jim. Michael Kane.
Am I working now? Can you hear me?
You are, yes.
Oh, good. It took me a while to get it going. Anyway, I have something about John Ray. John Ray, who was a doctor as well, he was a surveyor. And about 5 years ago, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, which I'm a member, sponsored a trip for 4 people to do the same trip, to follow the same trip that John Ray did up north. And there were four of them that and they gave a talk. Four of them went set off, they dragging just walking and dragging the sleigh with them, and to follow the same trip that John Ray did. And two of them had to be lifted up and taken back again. They couldn't make it. So two of them actually made the whole trip. And they gave a talk about the trip and the conditions it was like, and walking, dragging a sleigh and walking in those temperatures. And it was quite interesting.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
I'm not sure where that trip was, but as well as before John Ray made it to the Arctic, he had to learn how to become a surveyor, like I guess you are. So he walked in January, February, and March from what is now Winnipeg to Sault Ste. Marie, and then down by snowshoe by himself in the dead of winter. Winnipeg, Sault Ste. Marie, down to the Toronto Magnetic and Survey School, which I believe was around Richmond Hill. Pretty incredible. Apart from it was major. That was just to upgrade his skills as a surveyor.
Yeah, amazing.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Okay, another question. This book is out as a hardback, an ebook, and an audiobook. What is your preference these days for reading a book like this? I'll start with that just by saying that I'd love to mark a book up. I had a professor once who said in class he hated a virgin book. I kind of agree with that, and I was able to underline and put notes in the margins and etc. So I prefer the paperback. Any other comments? Laurel, you had your hand up there for a minute. Sherry will come to you in a second.
Yeah, I had my hand up because I was going to ask a question, but I'll hold it till it's time. But for me, I'll read I usually read ebooks. This one I got the hardcover, and it's the adaptation from ebook to hardcover. It's almost uncomfortable.
And what do you mean by that? Oh, you mean reading the paperback or the hardcover is?
It's not as compact as the e-reader, and if I'm reading in bed,
I know.
I can't get comfortable.
Yeah,
Whereas the
I hear you.
e-reader I can hold with one hand.
Yeah, my sister said the same thing, that she finds that sometimes books are too heavy to read in bed.
Yeah. I got my 98-year-old mother onto the e-reader, and she loved to read all day. She loved it. She adapted to it. It took a while, but she adapted well. Anyway.
Good, thank you. Sherry, you had a comment, and then we'll come back to you. We'll come back to you, Margot. Sherry, unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is it in audiobook at the library? Because of my eyes, and I'm honest about it. I'm always on a book, but it's on audiobook. And I do it from the library. Is it an audiobook at the Toronto Public Library?
I don't quite know the answer to that, but I believe the answer is that since it was published as an audiobook by Audible, I think maybe someone knows the accurate answer. The Toronto Public Library do not accept or use, or whatever the word is, Audible books, but it is available from Audible, so you can buy from Amazon.
I'll check the library for you, Sherry, and I'll let you know.
Okay. I've
yeah.
checked it and it wasn't, that's why I was just wondering. I have had Audible in the past. But I have to be honest, I just seem to stick with the public library now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was extremely interesting. And Machu Picchu was mentioned. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Machu Picchu was mentioned, and I don't know anybody ever watches it, but I think it's on Sunday, it could be Sunday night. They have a series on the History Channel, the mysteries of the world. And I haven't even finished watching it because it's, it's an hour long, and it's all about Machu Picchu. I heard half of it, and it's really quite interesting. It's absolutely fascinating, actually.
Good.
So it's yeah, that's a very interesting shows they do. That series, The Mysteries of the World. It's quite fascinating.
Thank you. Margot, you had a call. You had your hand up there for a comment.
You asked about a book. There's just nothing like, a virgin new hardcover book that just the weight, the smell. I'm sorry, I never write in the books because that's sacrilege. But if it's a good book and I like it, I want to be able to share it and lend it to people. Might reduce the sales. I'm sorry, Peter, but there's nothing like a brand new book. I cherish it. And then you go back and reread it. But as you say about Machu Picchu, one of the things, and Peter, you were there about the same time I was when we were young and fit. It's amazing the altitude. And I have to admit, I saw everything from Inca Cola that has a lot of cocaine in it. Wonderful things to do with height. So that you didn't get sickness from the height. Just love the Inca Cola. Which of course, the original Coca-Cola have included cocaine in too, didn't it?
Yep.
Anyhow,
yep.
Back to you.
It did.
I think the curious thing when I was there was that before they did a lot of doctoring of photographs and photoshopping, any pictures you saw of Machu Picchu were all taken from the same spot. They have a wide green swath in front of you. On the left are the terrace buildings, and Huayna Picchu is up at the center of it. And on the wide green swath, there are 3 brown spots in the grass, one at each end and one in the middle. I found out when I stayed overnight in the ruins that the brown spots are center field and the 2 goals where the staff comes out and plays soccer.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Okay, another thought here. Shackleton's voyage from the Antarctica to South Georgia Island is considered the greatest small boat voyage of all time.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the plane, John Ray's sailing voyages on the Hudson Bay are even more impressive. What sailing voyages do you think are the most impressive? I go to modern sailing and thinking about the round the world solo things. I think they're pretty horrific and challenging. But if you go back in history, I don't know that, to my mind, I don't know that you can separate them. I think they all had such amazing challenges.
Yeah.
And if you had the leadership and the sailing and navigational knowledge, then you got farther and were more successful. You also had to have right clothes and food.
Not canvas.
Not canvas. No.
No.
No, and you look then you think, but you look at it and you think that how could they think that kind of clothing would be warm enough in such cold weather? I mean, maybe they just never experienced it and didn't understand what cold meant. But, and then of course you look to some of the Viking voyages and the voyages where the navigation was by the stars, and I don't know.
Yeah, I always think, I wonder how they navigated before Harrison came along and invented the chronometer. It's been very difficult.
Yeah, when they didn't know what they knew
Didn't know
what
longitude.
was, but they didn't know what latitude was. Was that?
Yeah, I think it was the other way around. The longitude
Yeah, vice versa.
they needed because they didn't have an accurate clock to tell them where they were.
Right.
And it's fascinating. I've been to the Greenwich in Greenwich. There's an exhibition of his clocks, and it's quite interesting if ever you're there.
Okay, on the website, Remembering John Franklin, members have posted comments casting doubts on the quotes in the book from contemporaries of John Franklin that were very negative about him. Franklin has long been lionized as a great hero, even when the wreck of his ship was found by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Has your opinion of Franklin changed by the book? No comments there?
It
Seamus?
solidified it because I read quite a lot about Jane Franklin, and she really was I think she spent more time apart than with Franklin, but she sort of made everybody, kowtow to what she believed or wanted to believe Franklin was. And I think this made him a real person with all the warts and all. He couldn't be what she thought he was. He wasn't perfect. And he was unfit for this particular task. They said he was too large and too old.
That is true. That is true.
At 69, was he? That was what the age was, if I remember?
He was mid-50s. And she
59.
doctored that photograph, that image they have of her. She had him thinner. She did have things doctored. Yeah.
But when you think 59 in that era, that was, as you say, old. I mean, today we look at 79 as old, but 59 at that era would have been considered old. Seamus, you have your hand up.
Yes, I have. And just on that comment on age, I think, Diane, for 59, you're doing very well, But
oh, aren't you sweet?
I'd want to mention one thing. I was looking back through my notes and not as organized as Peter Rowe. Recently, you may have seen on the Fifth Estate about 2 weeks ago, the chap Stockton. He's from California, from the States. He was the guy went down in the mini sub that disintegrated under the pressure of water. His name was
the Titanic.
Yes, I'm trying to think of his name. Stockton. Rush. Yes, thank you. And he had his pilot's license at 19. He had an advantage that he could do these things early, and that's great from his family's resources. But what I'm getting at is somebody was asking about Franklin. Franklin, like others, and Shackleton, they had huge egos, and I think they also were quite expert at practicing hubris, if that's relevant. But Stockton Rush, isn't that his name, Rush? It's a very interesting name. He actually had one rush that he never returned from. But he was interviewed by the Fifth Estate. They did a series over months, I presume. And this was before the last journey. But when they went down with the Fifth Estate and some of the crew, they went down a limited sort of distance. And he was saying to them that, regulations and rules, my interpretation, can sometimes get in the way. To me, he demonstrated, if it's appropriate, hubris. And it's very interesting that a parallel was drawn in the Fifth Estate with the captain of the Titanic, who didn't obey all the navigational and other expectations and rules. Neither did this guy. And they both ended up with Davy Jones and the same reason, unfortunately taking a lot of others with them. Did anybody else see that program?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, well, you can get it on the CBC documentary, but it was fascinating. It was called The Ocean Ranger, I think, and I think they had based themselves in Newfoundland, and they disregarded sort of various sort of regulations, and even people who were very expert in his field. He wouldn't listen to them, and he was convinced that he knew best, you know, and that's a very difficult thing to get around. Maybe Franklin thought that he knew best. I had a father like that. He thought that he knew better than anybody else. And well, let's put it this way, without going into details, his will that he made in his latter days was a recipe for a sort of equivalent of Titanic. Leave it at that, okay? So sometimes people get convinced. Hitler was an example, and so was Kaiser Wilhelm II. They really believed that they were on the true path, you know, as is Putin.
As Trump.
So these egos can lead them wildly astray and disconnected, and other. The Ocean Ranger, when it went down, sadly took the lives of others, and they paid like hundreds of thousands of dollars for a final trip to Davy Jones. Anyway, I thought it had a connection with Peter's work.
I very much.
Yeah.
I didn't see the CBC show about it all.
Yeah, it was the final show in this edition, and you will, Peter, and everybody else will be able to elucidate at another time a lot better than I am the details, okay?
When that happened, because of his book, I was approached by quite a few people, and especially the Wall Street Journal asked me to write an article comparing the personality of Stockton Rush with the characters from the 19th century.
Yes.
So, and there is quite a comparison.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank
Did you
you.
write the article?
Sorry,
Did you write the article?
I wrote it. And what happened was, after it had been submitted and they were about to print it, was that day was when they discovered what had happened, when they found the wreckage. So the entire story had changed. It was no longer a mystery. It was a tragedy. So, yeah, that's what happened. It didn't get published because of that.
It was a terrible tragedy. Terrible.
Yeah. Thank you, Seamus. Explorers often had Indigenous folk join their teams. What are your thoughts about how the explorers treated the Indigenous population and their Indigenous guides?
Well, I
Sherry?
think it's pretty clear when you read Peter's book that they didn't think of them except for what they could provide for the white explorer that was in charge of the operation. You know, they just they didn't exist as far as the record that was produced for us of the great discoveries.
Sherry, did you have something to add there?
Who?
Oh,
I thought
yeah, about the people taking relics and bones and artifacts to the Yale Peabody Museum. As I commented earlier, finally there were all these lawsuits, and finally, what was it? In 2020, Yale returned the artifacts to Peru. That was an amazing bit of history.
All right, I think we're just about done here. Are there any
We've got a couple
comments?
people. There's
Noel.
Seamus and then Noel and Sally have
No.
their hands up.
No, I'm
Okay.
okay. I'm okay.
Thank you, Seamus.
I'm
Sally?
okay.
I have to unmute first, Ellie. No, I think it depended on the individual explorers and how they treated the natives. Some of them treated them really well, and others treated them like dirt. So it was personality things, and I think that showed up in the book too, with the different personalities of some of the people.
Thank you, Noel. Are there any other comments that you would like to end off on besides saying thank you, Pete? It was an amazing book. Laurel,
Here, here.
thank you, Laurel. Noel, do you have another comment there? Are you
No, that was Sally waving her hand.
okay? Thank you.
And for once, Sally's got nothing to say.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, do that again, Sally.
Good clip. Good clip.
And Bill McNaughton, you've got two of you up here, one with a picture, one without, and your hand is up for the one without the picture. Do you have something?
I was just going to say, I think I just want to sort of second what Seamus said. Peter, we all hope you do very, very well in your operation. And we're looking forward to hearing the old Peter.
Here, here.
Here.
Don't wish me good luck. Wish the surgeon good luck.
When was your operation?
It will be the 9th of May.
Yeah.
The 9th of May is your operation, right?
Yes.
Okay. Good luck.
Yeah, absolutely. Good luck. All right. Thank you, Peter. Your book was amazing. The research you did on it is outstanding. And it was really good to read about the personalities, not just the adventures. And we will ignore that. Next week, we have myself and anybody who wants to join, and that will stop now. Our 90th anniversary celebration. I can hardly believe that we've been going 90 years. So there will be a cake. We'll take a look at some of the skippers we had. We'll take a look at the places we went, and some of the speakers that we had over the years. But bring your stories and bring your memories, and share. You'll have an opportunity. And then on June the 5th, we've got our June excursion, and we're going to be going to the St. Catharines Museum and the Welland Canal Museum. Those two museums are connected, by the way, so you're not going to have to go to two places. We'll try and arrange carpooling if we can. We will have lunch, it appears now, at George's Greek restaurant. My understanding is that the keg doesn't open until 4 o'clock, so that would be a little bit late. I will confirm that. Just check it out and let you know. So with that, folks, thank you for being here, and pipes out. There will be Zoom rooms afterwards if you wish.
Hi.